What are muscles? When we think about muscles, we often think about the gym or our physical strength. But what we don't know is that muscles play an immense role in our everyday life, to simply holding a pen or pencil down to even maintaining our posture. Let's learn more about muscles and muscle tissue. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue is voluntary and is attached to bone and has striations. Striations are strips that are formed by protein in muscle cells. Cardiac muscle tissue is involuntary and it is found only in the heart and also striated just like the skeletal muscle tissue. It contracts using sliding filament theory. Smooth muscle tissue can be found in the GI tract, guts, and stomach. This tissue has no striations and is involuntary. Let's take a look at functions of muscles. Muscles allow you to move, walk, run, hold a pen, and it also moves substances within the body such as blood and permits skeletal movement. Your body is constantly making small adjustments all the time to maintain posture and body position. Muscles also stabilize joints and maintain body temperature, which is thermogenesis. Functional characteristics of skeletal muscle: excitability and irritability. Excitability and irritability is the ability to respond to a stimulus, which can be communicated chemically or electrically. Contractility is the ability of muscle cells forcefully shortening when there is adequate stimulation. This is why muscle cells differ from other tissues within the body. Extensibility is the ability to stretch. This enables muscle to go beyond their resting length. Elasticity is the ability of a muscle cell to recoil and bounce back to its original length after being stretched. Gross anatomy of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle has three connective tissue wrappings. The first one is epimysium. This is the outer wrapping and is made out of dense, irregular connective tissue that goes around the whole muscle and turns into a tendon. Perimysium surrounds each fascicle and is also made out of dense, irregular tissue. Fascicles are in each skeletal muscle. The fibers are collected together. Endomysium is within the muscle and surrounds each individual muscle fiber and is made up of areolar connective tissue. Gross anatomy of the skeletal muscle also includes nerve and blood supply. Each muscle contains one nerve, one artery, and one or more veins. These structures all enter or exit near the central portion of the muscle and branch out through the connective tissue sheets. Skeletal muscle has a rich blood supply, which is needed for the amount of energy it takes to contract a muscle fiber. The rich blood provides oxygen and nutrients through the artery. Attachment sites include origin versus insertion. An origin is immovable, and when the muscle contracts, the bone is movable, matching the attachment site as an insertion. Direct or fleshy. Direct or fleshy is associated with the epimysium. If the muscle that is fused to the periosteum of the bone or pericardium of the cartilage. Indirect and tendons. Indirect muscle connective wrappings Stretch past muscle. Tendons chain the muscle to the connective tissue covering of the skeletal element. Sarcolemma is also known as the plasma membrane. This can carry an electric charge. Sarcoplasma is known also as the cytoplasma of a muscle cell. The sarcoplasma is like the cytoplasma of a muscle cell, and it contains large amounts of glycosomes. Glycosomes are granules of stored glycogen that provides glucose during muscle cell activity for ATP production. Myoglobin is like hemoglobin. It is a red pigment that stores oxygen and transports blood. Sarcoplasma reticular. This stores calcium and has a loose connective network of tubes. T-tubes are an extension of the sarcolemma and are located deep to the muscle cell. Myofibrils run parallel to its length and are densely packed in fibers. They also contain contractile elements of the skeletal muscle. Striations are colored bands formed by the arrangement of thick and thin fibers. A bands are dark and I bands are light. They are aligned, which makes them appear striated. Sarcomeres are the smallest functional contractile unit of muscle fiber. Myofilament is a smaller structure. Thin filament includes actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. Actin is pulled by myosin. Tropomyosin keeps myosin away from actin. Troponin pulls tropomyosin out of the way. These are all activities that take place in the sliding filament theory. Thick filament, also known as myosin, reaches out and grabs and pulls actin. Elastic filament, also known as titin, makes up the Z disc, also known as the Z line, and holds the thick filament in place. So as you can see in this drawing, a sarcomere is from Z disc to Z disc, also known as the Z line, which is this Z-like structure. M line goes down the middle. Thick filament is right here. As you can see, it's thick, so that's where it gets its name from. And thin filament is right here. And this whole thing is a myofibril. So what's next is the sliding filament mechanism, which is also known as the sliding filament theory. The sliding filament mechanism is a way that muscles contract. This happens when muscle proteins move past each other to generate movement. So step one in this process, calcium binds to troponin. Step two, bond between troponin and tropomyosin weaken. Step three, tropomyosin shifts. Step four, binding site on actin is now exposed. This creates step five, where cross bridge attaches. Step 6 is pivoting, which leads to a power stroke. The cross bridge now becomes detached. And 8 myosin is now reactivated. These are the steps in sliding filament mechanism, also known as sliding filament theory, and how muscles contract. The control of skeletal activity begins with a neuromuscular junction. A neuromuscular junction is a chemical synapse formed by the contact between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber. This involves synaptic terminal. A synaptic terminal is the ending of a presynaptic neuron where electrical signals are converted into a chemical signal. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that causes muscles to contract. Acetylcholine esterase is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. This stops excitation of a nerve after transmission of an impulse. The synaptic cleft is the space between neurons at a nerve synapse across which a nerve impulse is transmitted by a neurotransmitter. It also is known as a synaptic gap and is filled with fluid, but the fluid is mostly water. Motor end plates are specialized chemical synapses formed at the site where terminal branches of an axon of a motor neuron contract a targeted cell. Steps in excitation of muscle fiber. These steps occur when a muscle fiber is excited to fire an action potential. An action potential is triggered in a muscle fiber when depolarization happens due to excitation at its synapse. Arrival of an action potential at a synaptic terminal of a neuron happens. This causes the release of acetylcholine, which is a type of neurotransmitter. After acetylcholine is fired, binding of acetylcholine to a motor end plate happens, which opens up gates. Action potential in the sarcolemma occurs, which is also an electric shock. This returns everything to an initial state. Lastly, in the control of skeletal muscle activity is excitation, contraction, coupling. Excitation, contraction, coupling is the process by which an electrical stimulus triggers the release of calcium by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. First, action potential runs down the sarcolemma and T-tubes. Then, sarcoplasmic reticular releases calcium ions into the sarcoplasm. Skeletal muscle mechanics. Tension versus load. Tension is the force exerted by the muscle on an object, whereas load is the force exerted by an object on the muscle. There are two types of contractions: isotonic and isometric. Isotonic contractions generate force by changing the length of the muscle and can be concentric contractions of eccentric contractions. Isometric contractions generate force without changing the length of a muscle. Motor units. Motor units are made up of motor neurons and often work together to coordinate the contraction of a single muscle. Graded muscle response means that the brain has to think of how much power it needs to use. Wave or temporal summation occurs when the second stimulus of the same intensity is applied to a muscle before completion of the relaxation period of the first stimulus. Tetany is also known for causing tetanus. This is caused by spores. These both change the frequency of stimulation. Multiple motor summation, also known as recruitment. More motor units for stronger effects are used. Treppe is also known as the staircase effect. It is the process of warming up muscles before exercising, which is highly important. Muscle tone is how we are always contracting a little bit at a time. Muscle metabolism. In order for a muscle to contract, energy is needed. 4 to 6 seconds of ATP is stored. Phosphorylation of ADP by stored keratine phosphate. This means that ADP adds to ATP to make more energy. ATP generates through respiration. Anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation is non-oxygenated. Aerobic cellular respiration is oxygenated and has 30 ATP. For the energy system and sports activities, aerobic endurance and anaerobic threshold are needed. Aerobic endurance is how long muscles can go aerobically. Anaerobic threshold is the point that converts aerobic to anaerobic. Muscle fatigue is when the muscle runs out of ATP, and contracture is cramps that occur in the muscle. Oxygen depth means it needs to get rid of lactic acid. And muscles also produce heat. Muscle performance. Force of contraction. Number of muscle fibers present has to do with muscle fibers and muscle contraction. Relative size of muscle means the bigger the muscle is, the stronger. Degree of stretch, length, tension relationship means muscles work together best when they are slightly stretched and warmed up. Velocity and duration of contraction is influenced by muscle fiber types, load, and recruitment. Type of muscle fibers present are slow oxidative, which uses aerobic respiration, myoglobin, and they do not twitch fast. Fast glycolytic is an aerobic twitch that happens quickly. It is moderately fatigued and happens when you run or sprint. Fast oxidative is anaerobic metabolism, and it is easy to fatigue. It has no myoglobin, so they're white. Load means less load, faster contractions. Too much load is isometric contraction. Recruitment is adding motor units for faster and harder contractions. Adaptation to exercise increases fibers size aerobic, is low weight, high reps. And resistance exercises are swimming, biking, and jogging, which involve more capillaries and myoglobin. Smooth muscle. The structure of smooth muscle has no neuromuscular quality and is involuntary. The physiology of smooth muscle: cells come in sheets and contract as one. Cardiac muscle. The structure of cardiac muscle has striations and uses sliding filament theory to contract. Cells branch and are uninucleate. The physiology for cardiac muscle is that it has no neuromuscular junction and contracts as one. Homeostatic imbalances of the muscular system. Rigor mortis is when you are dead and have no ATP left within your body. Myasthenia gravis is when muscles are weak and eyelids are droopy. Effect of Curie and other chemicals. This comes from plants and block acetylcholine receptors. Disuse atrophy is when you do not move your muscles, you lose your strength, also known as use it or lose it. Overuse injuries are when the muscle tears or is overused. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, also known as DMD, is a genetic disorder and is an X-linked trait that causes atrophy. Sarcopenia is when muscles are weak in elderly folks. This is why it's important, if you know an elderly person, to take them for a walk if possible. Well, that's the end of muscles and muscle tissue. I hope you all were able to learn something, and until next time, appreciate your muscles a little more while you're running, jumping, or simply even walking or sitting up straight. See you soon.